I'm going to speak about human trafficking in a rather critical way, so it might sound somewhat different to the way in which the speakers before me have talked about it. But this is based on research and work that I've been doing for a number of years. So I would be happy to talk about it at the end of the panel. As both of the speakers have said before me, human trafficking is often confused with this idea about smuggling. Unlike smuggling, which is often thought of as an act out of necessity, an act of courage, an act of resistance, and it's usually connected to men's activities, human trafficking was branded by the Bush administration as one of the three evils, if you like, to haunt the world, alongside terrorism and drug trafficking, and that's how it's been taken up in the UN documents as well as in the US. And it seemed to affect mostly women and children. Now, beliefs about human trafficking have created a veritable anti-trafficking industry, as well as a set of very stable narratives that have helped to sustain law enforcement efforts to control immigration as well as transnationally organized crime, to support state policies and interventions that closely regulate sex industries, and they've put in place, or helped to put in place, an array of social work and other activities aimed at undocumented migrants, sex workers, and bonded workers, or bonded laborers. Human trafficking, as was said earlier, is often conflated with the sex trade or prostitution, and has created for us this notion of sex trafficking, and I'm sure many of you have heard about that, and we hear about it often in the media. Sex trafficking has become the metaphor, if you like, for talking about the degraded state of humanity in the 21st century, and has become a main way to critique a variety of contemporary social relations of power at local and global levels. However, the history of human trafficking tells us that it's a state response of primarily Western European and North American countries, as well as the UN, to 19th century and early 20th century migrations, cross-border migrations, by particularly women that were part of the large-scale dislocations that followed the abolition of slavery in the 19th century. What we were seeing at that point was mainly poor and working class men and women crossing borders, clandestinely or not, to find new futures. They would search for better living or working conditions. They endured systems of bonded labor and indentured servitude. And for any of you who may be familiar with, say, the Caribbean history of indentured workers coming from India, that's the kind of systems we're talking about. And they were positioned and maintained as cheap disposable labor forces, very much like many of the labor migrations we're seeing today. However, the narratives in the 19th century about the mobility and the trade of labor and bodies ignored the causes for the migration, which had to do with the globalization of capitalism at that point, and produced a moral panic around which really focused on women and produced this idea about the white slave trade. And the panic about women being coerced, kidnapped, deceived, lured, trapped, and forced into leaving home and working in the sex trade in another country. It was called this white slave trade then. Today, the panic is not just about what's now being called sex trafficking, right? But also what some call modern day slavery. And human trafficking is thought to take place across many international borders and for a range of industries and jobs. And one of the specifications that the UN has for this notion of trafficking is that you have to be coerced into not just crossing a border, but into employment in some kind of work. So there has to be a purpose for you crossing the border. And it's to do with exploitation of labor. However, if we unpack the narrative today, what we see is that it fundamentally concerns the undocumented movement of people across borders for work and a concern about women in prostitution. The fight against human trafficking is therefore today not only a moral panic, but is virtually synonymous with the prosecution of people who move or employ others in defiance of or through the circumvention of legal boundaries and borders. It's a war on international crime and a problem of national security. There are many aspects that are troubling about the way in which human trafficking is presented to us and discussed in the media and the public and so forth. And it rolls off our tongues very easily. I'm sure many people can talk about it. But time and again we're seeing that, and research is showing us, and work with people who are considered to be trafficked are showing us that there are a number of problems in the way in which this is done. First of all, it advocates a greater criminalization of greater areas of social life, but fails to reduce the reason for undocumented migration and cross-border movement. It may change some avenues of migration, and but often pushes more activities underground. So we're seeing different ways in which people seek to move around the world. A lot of anti-trafficking doesn't actually change that attempt to move. Secondly, even though there may be special visas and policies put in place for trafficked victims, these come with quite a high price. Often people have to cooperate with the state and identify their trafficker or smuggler. And rather than turning in a person who has helped you to cross a border and get away from those conditions that you're trying to leave, people do not want to identify them as trafficked, right, and seek help and assistance. So what we're seeing is that growing numbers of immigrants are being processed through criminal justice systems because they're not identified as trafficked victims. They're most commonly detained and deported under the charge of being undocumented or illegal. Once home, if they're deported, they face the shame and humiliation that accompanies a deportee status, or they may be facing stigmatization because of being associated with work in the sex trade. However, we also know that the conditions in which they're being sent back to will not have changed very much. And it's argued that anti-trafficking efforts to repress migration, or to keep people at home, or to push them back, often do greater harm than good and run counter to the migrants' own interests. The public attention to trafficking draws our attention very quickly to the middle persons who are seen to be the traffickers, recruiting agents and those who assist others to move without legal documents or money, perhaps. And they're seen as to be the real menaces in this story. And they're commonly identified as greedy, immoral men from the global south and post-socialist states. And we see the sort of racist implications for that. Fifthly, what we see is that it's mostly women and children, mostly poor, brown or black women and girls from Asia, Africa and Latin America, who are seen to be kidnapped, transported against their will over borders and held in inhuman conditions. The idea of the trafficked victim ideologically locates the migrant or sex worker as helpful and pitiful, as acted upon rather than having any kind of agency in the trafficking story. And victims in this view are to be rescued and to be saved from their circumstances by others who stand outside of the trafficking process and who know best. Right? This doesn't always resonate with how migrants see themselves and how they consider their own situation, and can run counter to the and be quite counterproductive in social justice work. And finally, claims about the problem of trafficking are largely unsubstantiated. We don't have many figures for trafficking, but there are a lot of claims and there's a lot of hype about it. The US State Department's campaign against trafficking is probably a very good example of the way in which this hype has continued. It has set up a system in which it ranks governments around the world on their efforts to combat trafficking, and that countries that do not comply with the standards are placed in the lowest tier and are threatened with economic sanctions. The US State Department has the ranking of 3 tiers into which countries are placed. Tier 3, however, is constituted mostly by countries that the US considers to be unruly or undemocratic or terrorist states. So we find Cuba, Venezuela, North Korea, Burma, and Iran continuously coming back in Tier 3 as the countries that are not working on trafficking issues. And it's led most analysts to conclude that the US campaign is plagued by a lack of evidence, unsystematic data collection, and a lack of analysis. It is to some of us a neo-imperialist campaign which has little to do with people's rights or social justice and has everything to do with political control. So by way of conclusion, let me say that the idea of human trafficking, to me, masks the underlying causes for people's migration and works to repress and oppress people, especially women, through enforcing greater state control of movement and employment. It doesn't do much to break down local or global inequalities, but sustains and deepens those that exist. I think it's wise that this organization, No One Is Illegal, abandon the idea of human trafficking and continue to work on the work that it's doing to support the idea of freedom to move, freedom to stay, and freedom to return.